today we got a lot to get through. We're doing a deep dive of the gaming performance of the Alienware X17, and this is my particular variant. Okay, and disclaimer, I did not overclock this system. I wanted to give fresh out of the box stats so that you know if it's worth it to pay for the extra i9 instead of the i7, as well as the 64 gigabytes of RAM. I think this is going to give you the most realistic view of if you should step up to buy this version or get the lower version. Unfortunately, with the 4K 120Hz panel, you do not get the updated MUD switch in the new BIOS update. So that means in order to get the full bandwidth of my graphics card, I have to use an external display. However, depending on the game, you still will get decent numbers with the internal display. So let's get this started with Call of Duty Warzone. In Call of Duty Warzone, the system performs fairly well. If you think about 4K at around 95 to about 110 frames per second, and this is on the highest settings possible. I would say that if you are a competitive player, then potentially you may want to hook this up to one of the higher frame panels like your 144, 4K 2.1, HDMI 2.1 panels, or particularly a 1440p up to 165 or something like that, as if you do downgrade the resolution, you do get a higher performance from a frame per second standpoint. The main difference plugging into my LG CX48 is that you get the same range of frames, except you stay on that higher tier. So you stay in the 100 to 113, 15 frames per second per se the whole time that you're playing. Now switching over to Hades, which is a very fun game, you're going to stick around in that 60 to 68 range. Every once in a while you'll hit a 70, low 70s. And again, this is 4K 3840 by 2160 settings, as there's not a lot of settings you can change in this particular game. But even though it sits at that 60, mid 60 range, high 60 range, it's fluid and it plays, really well. However, surprisingly, moving over into the external monitor, it literally sat at 120 and did not budge. And so it's super interesting that the internal graphics card that it has to push through gives it this much of a performance decrease, because we were in the 60s, high 60s, 70s every once in a while in my gameplay. But on an external monitor on this one, literally locked at 120 without budging. I mean, we're talking about 60 frames per second here. So I mean, this is an extreme drop in performance by having to work through that internal graphics card for this particular game. And so I hope that in the future they are able to add a MUX switch in a future BIOS update like they did for the other panels. But as of right now, I mean, this is an extreme drop. And moving on to Forza Horizon 4, and I apologize for the blurry footage here, it did not disappoint. At a locked 120 frames, it got up to 91, and as you look through the CPU simulation, CPU render, and GPU, you can see that it was capable of getting higher. And then at the other resolution, at 1440p, it got 119 out of 20, and then again in the simulations, 218, 116 in the CPU, and then again 166 for the GPU. And so that lets you know that if you unlock it, you'll get a higher, like I did here at 1080p. As you can see, it was locked 120 out of 120, but the CPU simulation 223, CPU render 172, and the GPU 205.2. And so let's jump over to the external monitor. At the absolute highest settings you can go, and I mean the highest settings you can go within Forza Horizon 4, this laptop will push out 70 frames per second with an unlocked variable rate, frame rate. And as you can see, CPU simulation 202, CPU render 127, and the GPU right at 70 frames per second. Dropping those settings down to your normal ultra settings, you're right at 107 frames per second by average. And as you can see, CPU simulation 212, CPU render 133, and GPU average 110 frames per second. And just to give you a kind of a glimpse, if you drop them down to the high settings, you're at that 137 frames per second average. And again, this is at 4K. And so the performance in Forza Horizon 4 for this laptop is really great compared to some of the tests that I've done in the past. Jumping over to Ascent, we got some really stable gameplay right at around the high 90s, low 100 frames per second on the laptop itself. It played smooth, it looked great on a 4K screen. So, you know, no disappointment whatsoever with the Ascent game. So let's jump over to the LG. On the LG CX48, we got an average of a higher tier of the hundreds, so 110, 112. Every once in a while, you would hit 120, 124 frames per second as far as the monitoring goes. Now, this panel is a 120 hertz panel, so we weren't going over that technically, but it was testing out at that using the MSI Afterburner tool. So interesting performance for the Ascent game, really smooth gameplay. I'm not sure if the architecture is more geared toward a different method of fueling it, but it was smooth on both the laptop as well as the LG, but of course it did get a consistent higher frame rate on the external monitor. And just a quick note, if you do want to plug this into an external monitor that is a 1440p or 1080p with a higher frame rate, you definitely will be able to take advantage of some of those higher frame rates and get some pretty ridiculous numbers. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 I left for last because this game is baffling me. Without getting into the BIOS or the Alienware Command Center and doing, I guess, overclocks, the numbers are kind of inconsistent and awkward to say the least. And what do I mean by that? I mean, on the laptop, you get a consistent 40-ish, 45, 46, 47 frames per second, but switching over to the display, the LG CX48, you don't really get that big of a boost. And you know, we're maybe about 6 frames per second on average, a little bit higher than we were on the laptop, if not the same right here. And let me fast forward this just a little bit, because even in other areas you go down, and so it's just confusing because you really have to play with the settings to get a decent frame rate. And it's really weird also because you get such high frame rates in the menus, which is normal, but it tanks extremely when you get back out to the gameplay. Now, could some of this be the Cyberpunk game itself due to all of the issues that they're having? Absolutely. But I just thought that was kind of weird that it's working that way. And so, I don't know, Cyberpunk is a game that continues to test systems, but test our patience as well. So, I don't know. I have no idea on that one. So that's going to be it for me today. Let me know your thoughts, comments, and further questions that you might have in the comment section below. Again, I wanted this to be baseline, fresh out of the box with no overclock. And from that, the results were, I guess, mixed. We have some games that performed really, really well, and then we had some games that, well, we had one game, Cyberpunk, that played horrible. But from a 4K panel, for a laptop, you know, this performed pretty decent. And once you plug it into a, you know, secondary display, it performs pretty well. So with that being said, as always, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay cozy in that crazy world, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.